Hello everyone, and welcome back to part 2 in our discussion on sequencing rhythmic elements. This video is going to be all about different ways to create interesting groove patterns for our beats. So let's first talk about adding groove, or what is more commonly referred to as swing, to our rhythmic patterns. So what we have on the sequencer here is a really simple, straightforward beat that sounds like this. So this beat's a little bit tight sounding and doesn't have a nice rhythm to it. But what we can do is use different amounts of swing to kind of freshen up our beat a bit. So you can add swing either globally to an entire project at the same time by selecting the swing button and then turning the large encoder on machine to adjust the amount of swing. And you can see it on the interface as well, right here in the upper right hand corner of the screen. And we could just set that to 50%. Or you can also adjust this in the software window by selecting the swing button from this top menu here and just pushing that up or down. So to demo what this sounds like, I have it to set to 50%, and that sounds like this. Whereas before, without any swing, it sounded like this. So you can hear that it's really increased the amount of shuffle to our overall groove. The cool part about adding swing globally to an entire project is whenever we add in new instruments, say for example we add in a bass line or a lead part, those new instruments will also have the same amount of swing that our drums currently have as well, because this groove is going to be applied to the entire project. So for now I just have everything reset to 0, and then we can also add this into the various different individual groups in our project. So hit the arranger view until it takes you to this view, and then from here it'll let you control the groove of each individual section. So right now it's set to sound. We can go over to our whole drum group. We want to apply swing to that whole section. Or for the sake of this example, let's just use it on the hi-hat. So go over to the pad mode, select the hi-hat, and then go back to the arrangement view. Hit sound, then make sure it's on the groove mode. If it's set to one of the other modes like input or output, just use the push encoder to switch back and forth. From here we have several different controls that we can use to adjust the amount of groove on our individual channel. The first of which is the amount control, which just controls the amount of swing that we've added to our pattern. So right now we've added a 31% swing to our hi-hat pattern, but the other sections inside of our drum group, the kick and snare, won't have any swing applied to them. And that just sounds like this. The next control is the cycle control. You can think of this as the flavor of your swing, or the rhythmic style that the swing is going to take on. The default is set normally to 1/8, which means that every other eighth note is going to be swung. So the first eighth note in your pattern won't be swung, but then the second note in the pattern will be shifted, the next one will not be shifted, and then so on and so forth. Here's what the eighth note cycle sounds like on our hi-hats, and I'll change it over to the 3/16, which is going to give it a little bit more of a triplet feel. So you can see that the overall style of the swing changes based on which cycle we have set. So the last control in this section is the invert control. So by default, the swing mode pushes the note back in time, so it delays it slightly. This means that the drum sound is being triggered a little bit late. What the invert control does is it pushes the drum sound to play slightly before the beat instead of after it. And that sounds like this. So this is kind of a subtle change, and it's a bit harder to hear on this pattern specifically because we have a hi-hat that's being played continuously, but just know that the rhythm of the notes are being pulled slightly forward in time rather than being pushed back whenever this is enabled. So now that we have our groove settings out of the way, let's take things a step further and start sequencing off of machine's grid. We can start by adjusting our grid's snap value, so just hit shift and then grid like we did in the last video, navigate over to the step mode, and then change the note grid to off. So you can either use this button to select everything, or you can select them from the pads. Now, whenever we move back to our drum sequencer, if we have an individual note selected, like this hi-hat, we can push that back slightly in time, or push it slightly forward in time as well. So this lets us take even more control over exactly how our pattern is going to be shuffled. So you may potentially want to use this for creating more advanced swing patterns, but you can also use it for more practical things like layering samples. So back in Machine Software, let's go ahead and open up another project with a house style beat, and I can show you how this could be used in a more practical setting. So over in this session, I have a basic kick, clap, and ride cymbal pattern that sounds like this. So what we're going to do in this session is something called a pre-shifted clap. This is a common practice whenever making house or electro house beats, and adds a bit of shuffle and impact to your drum grooves. So just hit shift and then grid, change it to off. Then we can move back to our sequencer, make sure that the clap is selected, and then we can go in and just move our claps slightly before the beat. And that'll sound like this. So the clap sample starts just before the kick drum, giving a little bit more transient and impact to our clap that you wouldn't be able to achieve if the clap was hitting on the same downbeat at the exact same time as our kick sample. It just adds a little bit more shuffle to our overall pattern. So just because features like turning off the note grid may lend itself to more experimental rhythms, it doesn't automatically mean that it can't have some more practical uses, like pre-shifting claps, for example. So now let's go ahead and move on to something a little bit more experimental, polyrhythms. So for this, I can just go and open a new session inside of Machine Software so that we have our new drum kit to work with and also a new BPM. So what a polyrhythm is just whenever you combine two different time signatures together on top of one another to create new rhythmic patterns. So let's first take a look at a really basic polyrhythm, which is what you can actually see in this clip that I have loaded up. So what we have along the top here is 4 different kick drums. They're playing at a 4/4 time. And then we have some basic hi-hat triplets that are layered on top of that. So usually, whenever you're subdividing out the rhythm, you'd have 4 different notes here, which would be 4/16 notes, instead of 3 notes like we have in this pattern. This is why this is known as a triplet, because you're playing 3 notes where there normally would be 4 notes. And this creates kind of a nice shuffled feel. This sounds like this. So what's really going on musically here is you have a 4/4 kick pattern that's playing on every single downbeat, and then you have another rhythmic element, which is a 3/4 rhythm that's happening on top of our 4/4 rhythm. But let's take this a little bit further and create something a bit more complex. So what we can do for now is remove our pattern. We can just hit pattern and then delete. And then just create a new pattern here. And then what we're going to be doing here is creating a more complex polyrhythm. We're going to have a 4/4 kick and snare pattern. And then we're going to layer a hi-hat pattern that's in a 5/4 time signature and play that on top of it. If you're familiar with the artist Flying Lotus, who makes lots of experimental hip-hop style beats, then you may have heard this rhythmic technique before. So this technique can be really great to create different experimental hip-hop style beats. So back in Machine, to set this up, we can first change the project's time signature to 5/16, and then set the pattern length to 4 bars, so that gives us a 4-bar clip. And then this will give us a musical pattern that's the same rhythmic length as a regular 1-bar clip and a normal 4/4 time signature. And then you also want to make sure that your grid snap is set to 16th notes. So what we've just set up here is not a time signature change, rather it's an unusual subdivision of a normal MIDI sequencer grid. This will let us program beats that have a basic 4/4 kick pattern, but then we can go in between the beats and create really interesting hi-hat patterns and articulations to give our whole track a really nice shuffle. So we can go ahead and start by sequencing our kick pattern. So make sure that your kick is selected, move over to your sequencer, and then normally with the grid, we can go in and just sequence at the beginning like so, but because we've changed our grid spacing, we no longer could do it this way. Rather, you have to go across diagonally to create a 4/4 kick pattern, which you can see in this window here. You also want to make sure that this white box here is also navigated over to the left all the way. So just adjust that by turning this third rotary encoder. Next, we can move over to the snare sound. And then make sure that this is all the way over to the left. Put the snares on this corner and at the top right corner. So this just gives us a simple 4 on the floor kick and snare pattern. And of course, don't forget to set fixed velocity, which is something I feel like I always do. Okay, so now it sounds like this. So far nothing's changed. We have a simple 4 on the floor kick pattern that's playing at a regular 4/4 time. But as you may have noticed, if you pay attention to the spacing in between these notes, which can actually be a little bit easier seen down in the software window, if we change over to there, if we count the notes that are in between everything, we have 5 notes between each section, which I'll just quickly sequence out with a hi-hat. So instead of there being 4 notes in one sequence like with 16th notes, we instead can put 5 16th notes into one of these small sequences. So if I go ahead and fill out this entire section with hi-hats, you can hear what this effect sounds like. So just move over by using that knob and fill out our whole sequence. So this is going to sound a little bit crazy, but this is what this sounds like so far. So it gives us this really interesting shuffled pattern. So for now, we can just undo our hi-hat pattern. But this starts to get really interesting whenever you do more intricate hi-hat, kick, and snare patterns. So we could do something like this. And another cool byproduct about changing up our note grid this way as well is our traditional MIDI sequences that we may program on these pads will be totally inverted because the location of the downbeat on the pads has totally changed. So it kind of makes this program beats a little bit more randomly and just kind of feeling out what works best. So far that hi-hat pattern that I showed you sounds like this. So overall, this beat has this really cool shuffled feel to it. Let's go ahead and add in one more kick drum. And we could do that somewhere, maybe just before our kick. And that sounds like this. So what we have here is still a basic 4/4 beat, but we can create rhythmic sequences with this really cool, heavily shuffled feel that wouldn't be possible to program on a normal 4/4 grid. Alternatively, you can even get more shuffle if you change your time signature to 7/16, and that'll enable you to put 7 16th notes in the first quarter note section. So this is definitely something that's worth playing around with, especially if you want to create really interesting experimental hip-hop beats. So that finishes up our segment on different ways to program rhythmic elements in Machine. Join me in the next video where I'll be talking about advanced ways to edit and sequence melodic elements in Machine. Thanks, and I'll see you there.